Hello class and welcome to lesson 3.1, which is about fractions and decimals. By the end of the lesson you will be able to write fractions in their decimal form and then compare decimals and fractions. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the two different types of decimals. There are terminating decimals whose digits end, and then there are repeating decimals where one or more digits repeats without end. So for example, 0.75, that comes to an end. We could add zeros on the end forever, but we don't need them. So this decimal comes to a conclusion. A repeating decimal, however, might be 0.3333, etc. When we write out repeating decimals, we write it with that notation of a bar above the number that's repeating. So if it was a case where there are two numbers repeating, so such as 4545, etc., etc., we would write it as a bar notation of 0 with 4, 5 repeating, with the bar going over both of them. Sometimes you will run into repeating decimals where the first number is not repeated, but then there's a pattern after. So if you run into this, you would go 0.7, and then the bar would only go over the 1 and the 3, because those are the two numbers that are repeating. So when you're using this bar notation to indicate repeating numbers, make sure the bar is only over the top of the numbers that are actually repeating. So our first job is to take fractions and turn them into decimals. We do this by using division. So remember, the denominator, that's the number we're using to divide, and this is the number we're dividing. So when we set this up, we are going to have 16 going into 3. Now 16 can't go into 3, so we're going to go ahead and put a 0 over the top of it, and we're going to add in our decimal after the 3. And remember, we can always add in as many zeros as we need. So now we're looking at how many times 16 goes into 30. It goes in one time, so we bring down the 16, and then we subtract. We're going to have to do some borrowing so that we can actually do our subtraction, and after we subtract, we end up with 14. Bring down the next 0. Now we're looking at how many times 16 goes into 140. 16 goes into 148 times, which is going to give us 16 times 8, or 128. Again, we're going to need to borrow for our subtraction. So 10 minus 8 gives us 2. 3 minus 2 gives us 1. And bring down another 0. 16 can go into 127 times. And when I do 16 times 7, I'm going to end up with 112. Again, borrowing to do my subtraction. I'm going to end up with 10 minus 2, which is 8. 1 minus 1, which is 0. I'm going to have to add another 0 onto the end. Bring that down. 16 goes into 80 5 times. So we're going to put that 5 up top. $16 times 5 is 80, and then we're going to go ahead and subtract, and we end up with 0. Now our decimal point, which we put in at the start, needs to come up and be part of our answer. So our final answer is 0.1875. So this decimal is a terminating decimal. It comes to an end. Go ahead and try this one on your own. We use 8 as the outside number, 7 as the inside number. Going through and doing our division, we end up with 0.875. Remember, with terminating decimals, we are not going to want to round because they are going to come to an end. So the next thing we are going to talk about is repeating decimals. We're going to use that same process as we did for terminating decimals with the 6 on the outside and the -5 on the inside. In this case, when you have a negative, you are going to leave the negative out for a moment while you are doing your division. So 6 can't go into 5, so we put a 0, and we're going to start adding our zeros onto the end, and putting in the decimal. So now we're looking at how many times 6 can go into 50, and that answer would be 8. 6 times 8 is 48. We do our subtraction, borrowing, and we end up with 2. Bring down a 0. We now see that 6 can go into 20 3 times. 6 times 3 is 18. Subtract, and we end up with 2. Bring down the 0. We end up with 20. 6 can go into 20 3 times. We bring down the 18, subtract, and we get a 2. If we brought down another 0, we're going to end up with 20 again. So we're going to keep getting that same answer over and over. So I can then bring my decimal up, and I get 0.83, and the 3 is what's repeating. Now, because we had a negative at the beginning, we want to make sure we put that negative sign back into our problem, giving us a negative 0.83 with the 3 repeating. Go ahead and try this one on your own. Using the 11 on the outside and the 2 on the inside, we do our division and we find a pattern of 1818 over and over, so 0.8 repeating. The last thing we're going to talk about is comparing numbers. When we compare numbers, we're still going to want to turn our fractions into decimals. So negative 5 over 8, we're going to put the 8 on the outside and the 5 on the inside, ignoring that negative momentarily. 8 can't go into 5, so I'm going to put the decimal in and add some zeros. 8 can go into 50 6 times, and we get 48. Subtract. With our borrowing, we're going to end up with 20. Bring down the 0. 8 can go into 20 2 times, which is going to give me 16. When I subtract that, I end up with 4. Bringing down another 0, that gives me 40. 8 goes into 40 5 times. 8 times 5 is 40. With 0 left over means that we're going to bring up our decimal. So our decimal for this portion is negative 0.625. We want to use the same idea on the other side. So we're going to have our 9 on the outside and our 6 on the inside. 9 can't go into 6, so we are going to put in a decimal and our zeros. 9 can go into 60, a total of 6 times. 9 times 6 is 54. When we subtract, we end up with 6. Bring down our 0. 9 can go into 60 6 times. 9 times 6 is 54. Subtract, and we end up with 6 again, giving us another 60. So we have a repeating pattern. So we can stop and say this decimal is negative 0.6 repeating. Now, when we are comparing these numbers, we look in the 10th place first. And for both of them, we have 6. So that means we're going to have to go to the 100th place. Because this is 6 repeating, we can add in a 6. So we've got 6 and 2. Because this is negative, negative 2 is bigger than negative 6. So negative 5/8 is greater than negative 6/9. Go ahead and try this one on your own. Turning 7/9 into a decimal, you find out it is 0.7 repeating. And 0.7 repeating is less than 0.87. Last thing we're going to talk about is word problems involving these quantities. So 30 out of 36 freshmen and 34 out of 40 sophomores participated in a marathon for charity. Which class had a greater fraction of participation? So we want to make sure we are looking for the bigger value here. So our first class, the freshmen, had 30 out of 36. So their fraction is 30 out of 36. We're going to want to turn that into a decimal. So we're going to put 36 on the outside and 30 on the inside. 36 can't go into 30, so I'm going to put a 0 and add my decimals. 36 can go into 36 can go into 300 8 times, which is going to give you 288. After I do my subtraction, I'm going to end up with 12. Bring down the 0. 36 can go into 120, a total of 3 times. 3 times 36 is 108. When I borrow and do that subtraction, I'm going to end up with 12 again. And I bring down another 0. So now we can see that we're going to have this repeating pattern going back to 3. So our freshmen have a participation of 0.8 with a 3 repeating. Now we're going to look at the sophomores. And their original fraction was 34 out of 40. So when I set this up, I'm going to have the 40 on the outside and the 34 on the inside. 40 can't go into 34, so I'm going to put my decimal, add my zeros. 40 can go into 340 8 times. 8 times 40 is 320. Doing my subtraction, I end up with 20, and I bring down a 0. 40 can go into 200, a total of 5 times. 40 times 5 is 200. I subtract, and that's the end of my decimal. So I have 0.85. So because the freshmen had 0.83 repeating and the sophomores had 0.85, the sophomores had a greater participation in the marathon. Go ahead and try this one on your own. 12 out of 20 is going to give you 0.6. 16 out of 25 is going to give you 0.64. So Miss Olson's class had a higher fraction of students earn an A on the test. If you have questions about this or anything else from the lesson, please feel free to reach out.